Okay. Now, previously on Homeland, as I said last time, what we did in our first gathering together, it was a kind of a strategic overview, talking about what it is that that sociological professionals indicate is likely to be happening in the next 50 years or so of your life and ours, that has to do with the major crisis that is impending, in the Western culture. And so that strategic analysis pointed out why it is as well, why your generation, the millennial generation, the civic generation of the 21st century, and our generation, the idealist baby boomer generation, the idealist generation of the 21st century, are going to be coming into an alliance with each other to attempt to address the major social crisis that's going to be falling upon Western civilization in the 21st century. And last Monday, last Friday, we addressed the logistical issues, moving from the strategic in the first week to the logistical information about the immediate past election on Tuesday, the 4th of November, talking about how the two political parties were attempting to frame the information about what it is that happened on Tuesday night to basically fulfill each of their own respective preconceived positions, and spinning and framing the facts to try to give the impression that the objective factual data just inductively generated the conclusion that meant that they were right. And we, at the end of each one of those two presentations, the first, the strategic, and the second, the simply logistical, I attempted to offer what I thought were some more profound insights that our idealist generation has come to during the 45 years or so that we've been out running around in the outside world since we left the academic community. And the first one that I pointed out was that I believe that we as allies in addressing this upcoming crisis have access to a secret resource, which has been identified by Dr. Crane Brinton and others as this faculty that is evolving in the human family, that gives us the capacity to actually experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one unified harmonic whole. And that by means of that direct experience, like seeing or hearing, we would be able to determine for ourselves, each of us, what type of human conduct, either individual or collective, is either in harmony with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. That this is a very specific proffered insight that has been set forth by Dr. Crane Brinton as sort of an idealist insight on the part of the greatest minds in Western culture. So that was the offering that we made at the end of the first session. And the offering I made at the end of the second session was this insight that has been come to by Dr. Talcott Parsons at Harvard University and Dr. Ralph Potter, that actually came to understand that there were four basic pillar beliefs that each individual human being has to either consciously or at least unconsciously come to answer for herself or himself, and pursuant to the answers to those questions will in fact be derived a particular mode of ethical reasoning for that person. And that mode of ethical reasoning, when applied to all of the basic questions that confront people during the course of our lives, will generate a philosophy, and therefore a derivative political philosophy. And I set forth the spectrum of political philosophies along the right-left sociological bar graph that was designed by Talcott Parsons, that showed that the actual community will divide ourselves into 7 basic alternative worldviews when confronted by any particular public policy problem, and they will proffer certain specific solutions or responses to that public policy problem predicated upon their fundamental assumptions about ultimate reality. And it will generate an authoritarian response, a reactionary response, a conservative response, a moderate response, a liberal response, a progressive response, and a utopian response. That this is the spectrum of worldviews that actually obtain and that are actually in practice in the world. And that Talcott Parsons and Dr. Ralph Potter were attempting to tell us that, look, that it doesn't do you any good, really, to just share basic objective information with people. If you just share basic objective information, they just won't hear it if it's inconsistent with their worldview. And no matter what you try to do, if you don't address their worldview, you aren't going to be able to persuade them to come over to your position. Now, this, of course, obtains only with regard to people who have an internally integrated worldview. And the reality is that most people don't. Most people don't think clearly enough or deeply enough to really come to understand that these four basic pillar beliefs are the underlying predicate for a worldview. They don't really know about that. And so therefore they can hold beliefs with regard to these four different issues that are completely internally inconsistent with each other. And for that reason, there's no internally self-referentially consistent principle that is derived from answering those four questions in a way that are all consistent one with each other. And so therefore there's lots and lots of people who have a completely garbled worldview. And so the politicians and the political parties take advantage of that. And so what they do is they try to frame up the issues to comport with their particular worldview, and they basically avoid dealing with the detailed facts. They just put out these different metaphors and these symbols and these kind of simple-minded images that they put out for marketing. And they anticipate people responding in this kind of Pavlovian way to try to associate themselves with some sort of a set of clear views on the subject without having to trouble themselves with the facts. But they just respond emotionally. So that was the second basic insight that I wanted to convey to you that we have come across, we idealists in the 45 years that we've been out running around in the world. These are two of them that I've encountered that I think are some of the most profound kind of insights that we've been offered. What I want to do today, after having the opening discussion on the strategic view of where we are in time, and then the immediate logistical place that we are right after the elections of last Tuesday, what I want to do today is I want to address the tactical moment that we're in. And that if you think about it, that ideas run from strategic to tactical to logistic. That tactics are all derivative of a strategic insight if they're going to be meaningful. And once you come to a strategic insight and you can derive certain tactical steps that if they're taken will effectually bring into being the strategic objective that you've got, you have to then, derivative of those tactics, you have to translate it into logistics, detailed logistics of where you have to go on a particular day, how many meetings you have to have, those type of logistical details. And so that's why we dealt with the election that had just been held on Tuesday as kind of an immediate logistical moment that we find ourselves in. And so that what I want to do, I said tonight, is I want to address the tactical one in the middle here of where we are. And I think it's extremely important to understand that virtually everything that's going on right now in the world of politics, before we actually delve into these more profound dimensions of consciousness and sense of identity and teleology and cosmology, etc., but from this simple political perspective, that virtually everything that is going on right now is taking place in the aftermath of the Cold War. That we are still in the kind of 25-year post-Cold War era. The United States and the Western powers had been confronting the Soviet Union and the socialist movement in the world for some almost 75 years prior to the end of the Cold War on December 31st of 1991. You've heard this week a lot of talk about the 25-year anniversary of the taking down of the Berlin Wall, and that meant that it was sort of inevitable that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. They all pretend in hindsight that they could all tell that at that time, but it wasn't true. That it didn't really officially dissolve until the night of December 31st of 1991, when President Gorbachev actually signed the release allowing all of the socialist republics in the Soviet Union to be independent if they chose to be so. But prior to that night, for 75 years, dating back all the way to the October Revolution in 1917, at the very conclusion of World War I, that when the Bolsheviks came to power in the Russian Revolution in October of 1917, what happened is the Western powers immediately responded by mobilizing a very little discussed foreign military expeditionary force that was actually launched and sent into Russia. And that many of you, let me just ask you, that how many of you have actually heard anything about the major military invasion of Russia by Western powers immediately after the Russian Revolution? Good, one. Okay, but the reality is that that's exactly what happened. That the United States Secretary of State under Wilson at that time, Robert Lansing, who we'll talk about in this course, Robert Lansing was in fact the uncle of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who under Eisenhower were the Secretary of State and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Robert Lansing, back in 1917, at the end of World War I, was the Secretary of State under Wilson. He was in fact the son-in-law of John W. Foster, who was the Secretary of State back in 1893 when the United States was engaged in taking over the Philippines, taking over the Hawaiian Islands, instigating the Spanish-American War, taking over Cuba in the Philippines. That whole major imperialist venture that went on was undertaken under the stewardship of John W. Foster, the Secretary of State at that time. And this was his actual son-in-law, who was married to his eldest daughter, who was the Secretary of State in 1917, and the uncle of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. We will talk about some of these things in more detail as we go through the course, so that you'll become familiar with some of these individuals, because it's important for you to understand that these people get up every single morning and put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. And these are just regular people who have come together and they have shared a certain intense common vision. And that because of that, they're able to coordinate their activities pursuant to that common vision, and they can actually impact history in that way. And these people have done that in the past. And we're going to be talking about this group of people down through the years. What I want to talk about now is this period that you're in, that we're still in, is the 25-year period. We're 23 years out now, but we're in the 25-year period immediately following the end of the Cold War that had gone on for some 75 years up until that point in time. And what I want to do, now I've sent to Andrew, I don't know if he forwarded it to any of you, but did you get it by the, now, and I'm sure you all sat right down and read it, all 60 pages of it, but this was a little research paper that I did a while ago, sat down and looked through all the different kind of public writings and discussions that were going on at conferences and stuff like that immediately prior to the end of the Cold War and in its immediate aftermath. And what I've done is I've set that forth for you. It's more or less an academic treatise on the kind of responses, the various responses that were had to the end of the Cold War on the part of spokespersons for these various worldviews that we talked about. Okay, and so that you'll see kind of a great deal of detail with page citations and quotations from the various articles that they had written and books that they had written, etc., during that time, so that you'll see the debate that broke out right at the end of the Cold War. It was instigated originally by Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama was a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. And in June of 1989, now this is like 3 years before the end of the Cold War, in December of 1991, he wrote an article in National Interest magazine called The End of History. And in that article, he predicted that the Soviet Union was going to dissolve on its own, under its own power, right within a matter of a few years, in the very near future. And in the article, he called upon the Western intellectual community to come together and to determine what the fundamental principles and values were of Western civilization, because they were going to have an opportunity immediately upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was going to be a very brief window of opportunity that was going to open, and the Western powers were going to have the opportunity to basically move their values into the world in the aftermath of the Cold War, and had the maximum possible chance of inducing these values throughout the world. But he pointed out that this window was going to close very quickly, and that there was going to arise very soon after this window closed a major upheaval with tribalism and religious conflicts between different ethnic and religious groups, and there was going to be a major period of disruption, and that unless the Western intellectual community gathered itself together effectively and inserted itself into that window of opportunity, they were going to miss the chance of really sharing the fundamental ideals of Western civilization with the rest of the world. Now, the unfortunate fact is that not many people believed him at that point. They didn't really think that the Soviet Union was in fact going to collapse. And so that he was disregarded. And so as I put in the article, that when the Soviet Union dissolved on the night of December 31st of 1991, the Western powers were caught with their ideological pants down. And they were just standing there like kind of deer in the headlights when this happened, and they didn't quite know what to do. And so there was this whole period where they rummaged around and gathered together and wrote articles and books and tried to figure out what to do about this before the window closed. And so that 60-page essay that I put together is something that you can, again, keep in your library for when the time comes that you really want to sit down and take a look at that and see what the details of the various arguments were that were tendered at that time. You'll be able to see it. But what I want to do is I want to give you kind of more of a first-person account of how this all came to pass, and what we were doing, many of us at the time, and the role that we played in these discussions, so that you can see that just as an individual person, you can play an important role in major historical events, and that's what you're being trained to do. Okay, so let me tell you the kind of how this story went, and then I'll share with you kind of a major insight. I think that a third major insight that we ought to have to take away with us from this course. So let me tell you that 10 years before the article was written by Francis Fukuyama in June of 1989, we had in June of 1979, we had just won the Karen Silkwood case. Karen Silkwood was the woman, the young 30-year-old health and safety worker at the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility in Oklahoma that Meryl Streep played in the movie Silkwood. And Kurt Russell and Cher were in it, and Mike Nichols directed it, and it was a big hoopla. But we did the case that was all that preceded that movie. So we had just won a $10.5 million judgment the largest judgment in the entire history of the United States up to that point in time, in June of 1979. And then we were immediately we secured an order from the federal court declaring unconstitutional the federal congressional statute that was passed, that the private nuclear industry had gotten it past Congress, setting a financial cap on the total legal liability. I think I mentioned this to you, setting a cap on the total legal liability that could be imposed by a civil jury on a member of the private nuclear industry for a single incident of a release of radiation into the community. We won the court order declaring that to be unconstitutional, and because of that, we won the $10.5 million judgment against the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation. We then were flown immediately from there to 3 Mile Island. We actually did the litigation at 3 Mile Island that stopped the Nuclear Regulatory Commission from pumping all the radioactive effluents out of the partially melted down core at the 3 Mile Island facility into the Susquehanna River, denying that there had been any meltdown of the core. We came in and got an injunction and stopped them from pumping the radioactive effluents into the water and proved that there was a meltdown and prevented that from happening, and then shut down the facility. And we came back from that particular set of cases. Oh, and by the way, we also stopped them from building the biggest nuclear power plant in the United States. They were going to be building it at a place in Oklahoma called, well, actually it translates an Indian place, called the Mutated Fox. It was called Black Fox was the place. It was going to be a big double-barrel nuke, and everybody in our staff went in because we were out there doing the Karen Silkwood case anyhow. And so we found out about this, and we all went up, and everybody chained themselves to the bulldozers and with big carborundum chains. And so when all the police and everybody came and tried to saw the chains off, they kept breaking the blades on their little hatchets or whatever they had. So we ended up basically persuading all the police to say, look, you know what's going on here? They're building a private nuclear power plant. They never told you anything about it. You see that little windmill up there? That's so they can gauge where all the radioactive wastes are going to blow downstream on your families and stuff. And so we ended up doing those things. We did the Karen Silkwood case, won the largest judgment in history, got the federal court order that declared unconstitutional the cap, and because of that, no private insurance companies would ever insure a private nuclear power plant from that point on. And that's why they haven't been able to build any since 1979. Okay, and so when we completed all of that, we came back to Washington D.C. at the Christic Institute, and one of our staff people, Jim Garrison, Dr. James Garrison, who had been a staff member of mine at the Jesuit National Headquarters when I was chief counsel there in their National Social Ministry office. He had been my staff person on nuclear weapons. And we had worked diligently to get a peace pastoral put together to have the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops and the United Methodist Board of Homeland Ministry both signed on to this peace pastoral declaring the mere possession of nuclear weapons to be sinful. That the mere possession of them was sinful because they were inherently weapons of mass destruction, and that they were designed to kill innocent civilians, and that it was a violation of every principle of the just war theory. We had Father Brian Hare wrote a major treatise on this, which we attached to the peace pastoral, and we got it published. And Jim Garrison, had been my guy in the Jesuit headquarters who was going around twisting the arms of every one of the bishops. He would fly to wherever their city was, and he would follow them around and hound them until they signed the petition. And he just kept following them around, showing up in meetings, one after another, and saying, you know, the other bishops have all signed this, you haven't signed this yet. And he finally got that to happen. And so when we got all done doing that and got the peace pastoral draft all put together, and the Silkwood case won, and the 3 Mile Island case won, and stopped them from building any more nuclear power plants, Jim was going to be going back to Cambridge in England. He was finishing his PhD there in England. He was writing his PhD under a man whose name you should take down. It was J.A.T. Robinson. Dr. J.A.T. Robinson is the famous theologian who has written all the stuff on God is Dead. You know, the great white male anthropomorphic being sitting on a throne, you know, with his staff and stuff is dead, that nobody believes in that anymore. And so he was writing in the field of theology, trying to determine, what now? Now that sort of medieval, illiterate community God no longer is believed in, what is there? How do we salvage the verities, if any, of the Judeo-Christian beliefs? And so Jim was doing his PhD with him, and so he was getting set to fly back to England this night in I think it was like late August of 1979, because he's going to be starting up in that first week of September. So he and I were sitting out on the front lawn of the National Catholic Cathedral in Washington, D.C., big full moon out. We were sitting on the lawn, passing a doobie back and forth, and kind of discussing, what he was going to do now. Now that we were all done, and he was going back to the kind of humdrum world of the academy to actually go back and finish doing his last year of his PhD. And so he said, what am I going to do? What should I do now when I get my PhD done? And I said, easy, nuclear weapons. We've got to get rid of nuclear weapons. There are like 5,000 nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads in the world, all in place and fully deployed and ready to be launched, and another 10,000 of them that are in fact able to be put up on missiles and stuff right within a matter of a few days. I said, and they can destroy every single living thing on the planet 5 times over. I said, so we've got to get these stopped. So what we'll do here stateside is we'll organize with the major 54 religious denominations here in the United States and work at trying to get a unilateral cutback of 10% of the nuclear warheads in the U.S. arsenal. Because at that time, they had the SALT talks going on with Kissinger, the strategic arms limitation talks. And what they were doing is the United States and Russia were agreeing every year to build more than they had been planning to. So that instead of building 100 new ones, they'd only build 50 new ones. And they considered this to be progress.
This might be missing the entire point, but I just remember me and my brother talking about Chernobyl.
Chernobyl.
Yeah. And as soon as we seen the Wikipedia page, we just looked at each other like, was that us? Is that America? And this might be missing the whole point, but like, isn't it weird that the Cold War sort of ended at the same time that?
No, they were completely incompetent in their own right in the Soviet Union with regard to nuclear power stations. They're all over the world, and any one of them could fall apart at almost any given moment. And many of them have almost fallen apart. We've come very close on numerous occasions of major catastrophic events at these nuclear facilities. But what happened here is that when we had just gotten the case won, the Silkwood case and the 3 Mile Island case, et cetera, in August now of 1979, Jim was getting set to fly back to England. Jim had, what we said is, look, if we can get a unilateral cutback of 10% of the nuclear warheads in the United States arsenal, the Soviet Union, we have to get them to respond. If they don't respond, I mean, we're going to look like idiots, who have cut back 10% of our U.S. nuclear arsenal, and if they don't respond, we aren't going to make any progress after that. And so Jim said, okay, I'll do that part. He said, I'll do the Soviet part. So I said, okay, I'll go back and we'll do the U.S. side of this thing. And so Jim flies out. The next one, I take him to the airport. He flies back to England. He converted from being a Southern Baptist into being a Catholic. He went to see the Catholic chaplain at Cambridge University in England. And he said, my name is Jim Garrison. I'm best friend of Daniel Sheehan. We were at the Jesuit National Headquarters together. We've gotten the Peace Pastoral done. Here's the copy of the Peace Pastoral. We did the Silkwood case. Here it is. And he says, look, can you do anything to help me? We're trying to get a 10% cutback in the U.S. warheads, and we need to get the Soviet Union to respond. Do you have anything you could do to help me? Now see, that's not a real sophisticated position, to just approach somebody and just tell them exactly what the truth is and ask them if they can help you. But that's how you do things. if you're not worried about being embarrassed a little bit, you try to do the very best you can. You try to be as sophisticated as you can, but you don't have to be any more sophisticated than you are. And he went to the chaplain and took this position, and the chaplain said, well, gee, I don't know what in the world I could possibly do to help you, get the Soviet Union to agree to be responsive to this, but let me think. Well, he said, I just met a guy a few days ago who happens to be here in England, and he's writing a book. He's writing a book about nuclear weapons. It's called The Turning Point. His name is Fritjof Capra. It turns out to be the same guy that wrote The Tao of Physics, which is another book you ought to have on your list, to have on your shelf if you haven't read it yet. And she said, so he's writing a thing about nuclear weapons and how we have to get rid of nuclear weapons. We're at the turning point of human civilization. If we don't get rid of the nuclear weapons, we're going to destroy ourselves. So the chaplain introduces Jim to Fritjof Capra. Jim does the exact same thing. My name is Jimmy Garrison. I'm Ambassador Daniel Sheehan, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what can you do to help us get the Soviet Union to respond if we get a 10% cutback in the U.S. missiles or the warheads? And Fritjof Capra says, well, gee, I don't know, but I can tell you what. He said, I can introduce you to this lady, Mrs. Rose Cruz. This lady, she's 87 years old. She gave me the grant that I'm using to take the sabbatical to write this book. And she's a terrific lady, and she's opposed to nuclear weapons. She's part of Armand Hammer's group that go back and forth to the Soviet Union, this kind of citizens diplomacy. Private citizens going back and forth to the Soviet Union and trying to make friends with everybody and see if we can help, as private citizens, engage in some kind of negotiations with each other. And so he introduces Jim to Mrs. Rose Cruz. Jim sits down with her, tells her exactly who he is, what he wants to do. She agrees to give him a grant to cover all of his expenses for 2 years to go to the Soviet Union. And he goes back and finishes his PhD at Cambridge. And while it's getting reviewed and printed into a book called The Darkness of God by Dr. James Garrison, he ends up doing some research on the Soviet Union, getting ready to go over there. And he looks through the research and he says, this is crazy. All the people in the United States, both political parties are saying the Soviet Union is, trying to get ready to attack us, over the polar ice caps and stuff. And but when you really look into it, their ass is getting set to fall off over there in the Soviet Union. Their economy is in the dumps. They've been spending tons of money on military stuff. They aren't really in any position to attack us. And so he writes a book called The Myth of the Soviet Threat. And he gets it published by the same publisher that published his thesis. So he gets a copy of his book, and he goes and sits down with Mrs. Rose Cruz and says, what else can you do to help me? And she said, oh, well, by the way, she said, my husband, the brigadier, is best friend, who's now deceased, was the best friend of the man who is the president of the Royal Academy of Science here in England. And I'm going to introduce you to him and see if he can help you. And so the president of the Royal Academy of Science introduces Jim to all of the other members of the Royal Academy of Science, and Jim, being the pushy dude that he is, asks each one of them for a letter of introduction to his counterpart in the Soviet Academy of Science, in the Soviet Union. So Jim gets like these 12 letters of introduction to each of their respective counterparts in the Soviet Academy of Science, takes all these letters of introduction, he's got his little book, The Myth of the Soviet Threat, he's got his grant for 2 years to go there, gets on an airplane and flies to Russia and lands and goes into Red Square and walks all around looking at all the buildings at Red Square and says, okay, here I am. Now what am I going to do? So he goes and gets himself a little apartment, and what he does is he takes out the first letter and he goes and finds the guy and introduces himself. He says, here's the letter from your counterpart at the Royal Academy of Science. My name is Jimmy Garrison, I'm a friend of Daniel Sheehan, here's what we're trying to do. And the first 3 or 4 of these guys went, gee, I don't know what I can do to help you at all. And so nothing was happening. Finally, on the 4th or 5th guy, he sits down and talks to the guy, and the guy says, well, I don't know what I can do to help you, but I do know this. He said that one of my best friends is the medical doctor for Brezhnev. And Brezhnev is dying. And so my friend sees him virtually every day. So what I'll do is if you put a little note together, I'll give it to the doctor and have him say something to Brezhnev. when he sees him. And so Jim goes ahead and does that, and the guy goes and sees the doctor, and the doctor gives the note to Brezhnev. And Brezhnev authorizes Jim Garrison and his medical doctor to do a 3-hour documentary on Russian television showing what the consequences would be of one United States multi-warheaded missile, MIRV missile, landing at dead center in the Soviet Socialist republics. Of all the whole zone that would be totally useless for 1,000 years, all the contamination of the water that would seep into other places, the radiation that would blow over the other parts of the country. And they did this big 3-hour documentary. And then Brezhnev dies. Andropov comes in, and Jimmy is trying to figure out how to go meet Andropov to see if he can continue to get more cooperation from him. So Jimmy's sitting having a meeting with Shevardnadze and trying to get him to help him set up the meeting. And Shevardnadze goes, no, he says, it's not Andropov you want. Andropov, very sick man. He will be dying very soon. He says, who you want to talk to is Gorbachev. Gorbachev, KGB. He's the protege of Andropov. He is the Secretary of Agriculture. He's the guy you want to go see. I will set that up for you. So Jimmy, after being on the ground there for a matter of a few months, ends up getting to have a meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. And he goes to the Kremlin where he's going to meet him. And there are these big, like 12-foot high doors. So he goes in. I'm sitting down at Esalen, the Esalen Institute, sitting in a little hot tub with Jim, and he's telling me the story about how I got to meet Gorbachev, right? And he walks into this place, and he walks into the room, and Gorbachev comes in this door, another big 12-foot door, and is walking over toward him, and they get about 10 feet away from each other, and then they end up sitting down, and Jimmy Garrison says to him, look, my name is Jimmy Garrison, and I'm Ambassador Daniel Sheehan. Here's what we're trying to do. He goes through this whole routine. And Gorbachev says, look, so if we can get the United States to cut back 10% of their nuclear warheads, would you guys respond? And Gorbachev talks English some in private. He won't speak English in public. But he says to him, the United States will never unilaterally cut back on its nuclear warheads. He said, because they believe that they need to have them, not against us, he says, against China. He says, China can put 1 million men into the field under arms. And nobody can resist them militarily and with conventional military. He said, and the U.S. knows that from Korea. He said, so they believe they have to have these nuclear weapons. So if this is going to be done, we'll have to take the steps to unilaterally start to disarm. He said, and if we start to disarm our nuclear warheads, I might just as well go the whole way, he said. And so I will set up a thing as soon as I come into office. I will set up a thing called Glasnost and Perestroika, and we will start to review the history of our country. And we will start to disassemble our nuclear weapons and hope that the United States will respond in kind. But, he said, when I do this, they will come for me in the night. And I will be disappeared, he said. So you have to promise to become the head of the Gorbachev Foundation. And you will be the president of the Gorbachev Foundation, and you will carry on this task of getting this completed. And so here's Jimmy Garrison sitting with Mikhail Gorbachev going, okay, I'll do that. And so when Gorbachev comes to power, Gorbachev brings him down as a whole big city block off the Red Square, which is where the Gorbachev Foundation is. So Jimmy Garrison, my best friend from Harvard Divinity School, ends up being the president of the Gorbachev Foundation, right? And so they set up this whole thing, and they're going through the process, and he sets up Perestroika and Glasnost, and they start to disassemble their weapons, reaching out to the U.S. to reciprocate. He actually sits down with Reagan and proposes that they dismantle all their nuclear weapons. And Ronald Reagan actually said, that's a great idea, I think we'll agree to do that. Until all of his handlers got a hold of him and said, that's a real bad idea. And he was only kidding, which of course everybody believed immediately. And so that's how it started. That entire process started going on with Gorbachev. And what happened is in June of 1990, now follow me on this, George H.W. Bush is in office since 1988, who'd been the vice president under Ronald Reagan from 1980 to 1988. He's now the president of the United States in 1990. And he starts receiving information from the Central Intelligence Agency that it's likely that the Soviet Union is preparing to actually dissolve itself. That Gorbachev has decided he's going to give the different republics the option within another year or two. He's going to go through this process of glasnost and perestroika, but he's going to give them the opportunity to actually declare their independence if they choose to, and decide what type of relationship they want to have with the Russia. And what happens is in June of 1960, when H.W. Bush gets this information, he starts to freak out about the fact that the United States was now going to lose its ultimate adversary. The ultimate adversary that it had been using for almost 75 years to rationalize the fact that the United States was supporting fascist and authoritarian governments all around the world. Not only in Central America, but all throughout Europe, secretly funding fascists to run in elections in Japan and in the countries throughout Europe as a bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And so that he was afraid that they were going to be losing this ultimate adversary. So what he did is in June of 1990, he hand wrote a memo to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, saying to, and giving it to April Gillespie, who was the United States ambassador to Iraq at the time, and said that he wanted this hand delivered personally to Saddam Hussein and wanted her to stay there while he read it. She did. She brings it to him. And what it says is that George H.W. Bush says to Saddam Hussein, I know that you've been having difficulty with Kuwait on your southern border, and that you believe that they've been engaged in slant drilling under your borders into Iraq and stealing Iraqi oil. And I want to make it clear that if you find it necessary to resort to the use of military power against them, I would not view this as adverse to the long-term interests of the United States. At which point, Saddam Hussein mobilizes about 10,000 of his military troops down on the southern border of Iraq, on the northern border of Kuwait. And at that time, the Secretary of Defense, in June of 1990, for George H.W. Bush, his Secretary of Defense, anybody know who that is? Dick Cheney. Richard Cheney, his Secretary of Defense, contacts Prince Bandar, who is the United States ambassador from Saudi Arabia, and invites him to come to the West Wing, to come to Cheney's office. And he brings him to his office, and Doug Fife is there, and Scooter Libby is there, and Elliot Abrams is there, and who else was there? There was one other guy, David, anyway, I'll think of his name. Anyway, so anyway, they're all there in the meeting. And what Dick Cheney says to Prince Bandar is he said, we have very credible intelligence evidence telling us that Saddam Hussein is getting ready to invade Kuwait. And in fact, we have equally good intelligence that after he invades Kuwait and occupies Kuwait, he's going to go into Saudi Arabia. And he's going to overthrow the House of Saud, you guys, and occupy Saudi Arabia. And so then he brings him into the room and shows him real-time satellite photographs from the NSA, complete violation of his national security oath, shows him real-time NSA satellite photos of the 10,000 troops that are all assembled on the northern border of Kuwait. It says, see, we told you. So you can see we have credible information here in regard to both things I'm trying to tell you. So if you see that this actually happens, what I want to do is I want to set up a meeting. I want you to invite me to Saudi Arabia to have a face-to-face meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah. And what I want to do is I want to invoke an August 1972 secret protocol that was signed by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon in August of 1972, actually. He said, in that protocol, this is when Kissinger and Nixon flew to China in that secret mission, and they were on the Blackbird, the SR-71, the big stealth plane, and they were coming back from China, and they stopped in Saudi Arabia and had this major meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah. This is back in 1972, in August. And they entered into an agreement to renew the 60-year exclusive lease agreement that had been signed at the end of World War I, giving exclusive lease rights to the 7 Arab American oil companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, and British Petroleum, and the others. The Aramco, the Arab American Oil Corporation, had a 60-year exclusive lease agreement with Saudi Arabia. And they wanted to renew the agreement, even though it hadn't been expired quite yet. They wanted to get out ahead of that and renew the license. And what they did is they said that, look, this is Saudi Arabia now with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah. And they said, we will renew the agreement and we'll agree to allow you to raise the price of gasoline that you sell, petroleum, to the West, from the amount of 34 cents a gallon at the pump to $1.34 at the pump per gallon. But for that one extra dollar for every gallon of gasoline that you've raised the price, we want you to agree to do a number of 3 things. Number 1, we want you to spend part of that $1 extra per gallon that you're going to be getting on special military equipment from United States military contractors, like the AWACS, air reconnaissance radar, the over-the-horizon radar equipment, a whole series of them. Wanted them to agree to purchase those from major military contractors in the United States. Secondly, out of that extra $1 a gallon, we want you to use some of that money to dredge out 3 major harbors in Saudi Arabia so as to be able to take U.S. warships. And we want you to build 3 major new military bases where we can land big C-5A cargo planes and U.S. military troops and set up barracks and stuff for U.S. military troops. And thirdly is that in the event that either the Soviet Union or China makes a feint toward invading the oil fields of the Middle East, we want you to invite us to come in and occupy those military bases and bring our warships into those harbors and protect the oil fields against the Soviet Union or Chinese invasion and occupation. And that was the agreement that they struck in August of 1972 on the way back from China. And they went in on the way back and stopped in with Pahlavi in Iran, the Shah of Iran, and made a similar agreement with them. And so this secret agreement lay dormant for all of this time, from 1972 all the way to 1990. And so Dick Cheney invoked that agreement with Prince Bandar and said, if in fact it is proven true that Saddam Hussein invades and occupies Kuwait, and you see that we're telling you the truth, I want you to invite me in to have this meeting with King Fahd. Because what we want to do is we want to invoke that treaty. Even though it's not the Soviet Union or China, it's Saddam Hussein that's invaded, we want to invoke the treaty and have you invite us in. And so that's what they did. Sure enough, Saddam Hussein goes on into Kuwait and occupies Kuwait, and then Bandar issued the invitation, and Cheney flies to Saudi Arabia and goes in and has the meeting with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah. He invokes the 1972 treaty and asks them to invite the U.S. to come in and occupy the military bases and the harbors. Well, the chief of security for the House of Saud, Turki bin Faisal, 26 years, the chief of security for the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, the son of King Faisal, the older brother of Fahd, knows about the meeting, and so he comes into King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah after they leave the meeting. He says, look, don't do this. Do not invite the infidels into the Holy Lands. If you invite them in, they'll stay because they want to occupy the oil land and the Holy Lands here. And so please don't do this. I have an alternative suggestion for you. Just give me a chance to have a meeting with you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And so they agree to do that. They agree to hold off on deciding on the requests that have been made by Cheney. Next morning at 10 o'clock, into the office walks Turki bin Faisal with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah, and he brings 2 guys in with him. He brings in Khalil Mahfouz, who's the head of the Royal Saudi Bank for the royal family, and he brings in with him Mohammed Baroum, who is the eldest son in the wealthiest family in Saudi Arabia that owns all the steel companies and concrete corporations. And they come in and they sit down and they say, look, this is a real bad idea, inviting the infidels to come in to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We have an alternative for you. And they turn and they open the door, and in through the door walks Osama bin Laden, the best boyhood friend of Turki bin Faisal since the time they were 4 years old. And brings him into the meeting and says, look, he says, I have 10,000 Mujahideen troops sitting up in the Khyber Pass that have just gotten through kicking the crap out of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And we can come down in here and we can kick the crap out of Saddam Hussein, drive him out of Kuwait and drive him back into Iraq. And we don't need to invite the infidels in. If you invite the infidels in, they will not leave. And so here, and he spends an hour and a half with them with big wall charts showing how they can do this, etc. And they make this presentation. And then they get up and leave. And turns out that Dick Cheney is still there at the palace. Dick Cheney finds out about the meeting, and Dick Cheney asks for a second meeting with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah. And he comes in and he says, look, I've heard about this. There's another offer on the table here. I've invoked our treaty. I'll tell you what, I'm going to add a sweetener to the deal. That not only, if you invite us in to occupy these bases and these harbors, not only will we protect you against Saddam Hussein coming into your country trying to overthrow you, we will protect you against your own people. And they hate your guts. You know, your entire people here hate the House of Saud and Abdulaziz and these 1,300 princes with their, whoring around Europe and losing $1 million at the throw of a dice in Monte Carlo and their 16 Eldorado Cadillacs and all this stuff. He says they hate you. And so we will protect you against the Muslim Brotherhood, the radical Sunni fundamentalists who hate you. And that's the deal that got cut. And that the United States, through Dick Cheney and George H.W. Bush, agreed with the Saudis to protect them against the radical Sunni Muslim Brotherhood. And that's the deal that got struck. And that's exactly what happened. And then they come back. The United States has been invited in. They gather together the coalition of the willing, like Zaire and in Panama and a couple other major military powers of the world, and joined with them. And they went in and invaded and killed tens of thousands of people in the first Persian Gulf War, and slaughtered the Kuwaiti troops, drove Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq, and sure enough, did not pursue him into Iraq, dropped back and set up a no-fly zone, which prohibited any flights over Iraq, and it required 250,000 United States military personnel to be permanently based in Saudi Arabia to staff the no-fly zone. And that is when Osama bin Laden mounted the jihad against the United States and against their Western allies to drive them out of the Holy Lands. And that's why they bombed the Marine barracks, in Beirut. And that's why they in fact, bombed the U.S. embassies in Africa, and they attacked the USS Cole in Yemeni in the harbor. And that's what happened. And that's exactly what the moment is that you find yourself in now. That there's a clear, absolute undertaking on the part of this element inside the United States government to occupy the Middle Eastern oil fields to keep the Chinese from getting access to the oil in the Middle East. Because the Chinese lack major oil reserves. And this element, this reactionary element inside the United States, view themselves as being in this dialectical confrontation with China. Not with the Soviet Union, not with the ISIS, not with the radical fundamental Sunnis, but with China. Because they see the long game here. And what we're really dealing with here is a major confrontation that is taking place over the long haul between these forces. And I want to, just in closing, point out there's an important secret that you need to know. And that is, when the Soviet Union in fact dissolved on the night of December 31st of 1991, the very next Monday morning, in the first week of January of 1992, the Assistant Secretary of Defense under Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Doug Feith, and Elliot Abrams, and David Addington, and Bill Kristol gathered together in the West Wing, and they drafted up, and I want you to get this down, the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance Document. And in that document, they called for a complete alteration of the United States foreign policy and military policy to establish full spectrum dominance over the planet. And that they would build up military forces, not reduce the military spending of the United States, now that the Soviet Union had dissolved, but in fact increase it, so that we would be able to establish absolute, unquestioned unilateral dominion in every single corner of the world, and that no military power in any nation state or any other private organization could possibly challenge the superiority of U.S. military forces. And they put this forth. And on the morning of March 18th of 1972, they actually gathered together this 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document and distributed it to a select number of people in the cabinet and a select number of military generals in the Pentagon, but not to everybody. And this particular document was around, and somebody gave a copy of it to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post printed an editorial against it, saying, this is blatant imperialism. This is an actual retrenchment right back to the same particular worldview that guided the United States foreign policy back before World War I. Manifest destiny, the white man's burden. That in fact there was this whole kind of robber baron elite that thought that they had the right to go after all the resources of the world. This is raw imperialism. And in fact, the Post wrote an editorial against it, and the New York Times followed with an editorial the following Sunday in the Sunday Times. And George H.W. Bush, the president, issued a rare statement saying, we don't admit or deny that there is such a policy proposal, but even if there were, it would just be a draft, and we're going to have amendments to this. And so what he did is he personally supervised the crafting of a second alternative draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document called The Projection of U.S. Military Power into the 21st Century and Beyond. His co-authors were Colin Powell, his Chief of Military Staff, and Theodore G. Shackley, the Director of Covert Operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency, and the protege of Nazi war criminal General Major Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence for Nazi Germany in the Third Reich. And these guys put together this document, and what they proposed is that this ultimate strategic objective not be pursued by the United States unilaterally, but that it be done multilaterally, by just having the United States join with Canada, Mexico, not Mexico under the indigenous people down there, but the PRI, which is the Castilian Caucasian Spanish of the PRI. And the UK, France, Italy, the new reunified Germany, and, catch this, remember this quote, and Russia, now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces. Okay? And so what you see is that as distinct from the reactionary proposal that had been made by Cheney and Wolfowitz and Addington and the others, in the first draft, there was a conservative draft that was seeking the same exact strategic objectives, but doing so multilaterally rather than unilaterally. And it specifically states that the ultimate strategic mission was to maintain the continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed by members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. And when I saw that, these are still classified documents. When I saw that the first draft of this thing and the second draft of this thing, I said to myself, who the hell is the Northern Industrial Alliance? I mean, where did that come from? This is the alternative power structure that was going to be functioning through NATO to basically establish complete hegemony throughout the world. And they wanted to get Russia to come and join in on it as a Caucasian nation. And what happened is Putin resisted that and pushed back against them. And so what they did is they began to move through NATO to invite all of the different republics, the Caucasian republics from the former Soviet Union, to join NATO. And started to surround Russia entirely with NATO allies. And so this is what you see happening right now. So you see the United States pursuing the second draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And rather than pursue the reactionary policies, they're pursuing the conservative policies that George H.W. Bush proposed. And George H.W. Bush, just remember, would have in fact been elected for a second term back in November of 1992 if it hadn't been for Ross Perot. And this may have been before you were all paying a lot of attention, but Ross Perot ran against George H.W. Bush as an independent candidate in the 1992 election and took 19% of the vote. And for that reason, Bill Clinton won the presidential race in 1992 with only 43% of the popular vote, to 38% by George H.W. Bush. And so when George H.W. Bush lost, the people who were the authors of the reactionary first draft proposal, Dick Cheney, Addington, Paul Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams, and Scooter Libby, and those people, all banded together and created a thing called the Project for a New American Century. And they adopted the first draft as their foreign policy statement to establish full-scale, full-spectrum dominance, and basically reached out originally to Jeb Bush to get Jeb Bush to run for the presidency so that they could come into power behind him. But unfortunately, some people had photographs of Jeb Bush meeting with Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., the head of the Tamiami gun shop down in Miami, who was meeting with drug smugglers and illegal weapons smugglers to the Contras back in earlier. And so because everybody knew that we had those photographs, actually, Jeb couldn't run, didn't dare run, and so they reached out for W. And that's why it's so absolutely astonishing that anybody in the world would have ever suspected that they would try to run George W. Bush for the presidency, except for the fact that Dick Cheney was behind him and ran the entire government. And so that's what happened, is that when George H.W. Bush lost the 1992 election and Clinton came in, these reactionaries started organizing immediately to try, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, to reestablish the same imperialist policies that governed the robber baron era of imperialism in the Western world. And so the conservatives resisted them with the second option, let's do this unilaterally with all the Caucasian nations in the world, and that was the foreign policy of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, smarty that he was, says, why should we in fact set up some kind of a position farther to the left than we have to? If the reactionaries are going to be taking that position, we'll just adopt a conservative position. And so he puts forth a conservative foreign policy, and they organize a thing called the Democratic Leadership Conference with Richard Gebhardt and Clinton and others. And then they create, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the new, more moderate Democratic Party, who are in fact conservative. to the right of center. And the Republican Party becomes more and more dominated by the reactionaries, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Elliot Abrams and that whole crowd in the Project for a New American Century. And they end up becoming the dominant force in the Republican Party. And so what we see is the entire center of the United States political world shift dramatically at the end of the Cold War, so that we have a debate going on not between a liberal Democratic Party and a conservative Republican Party. We have a debate going on between a conservative Democratic Party and a completely reactionary Republican Party. And that's what's happening right now. And the progressive community and the liberal community basically stand there shifting from one foot to another, not knowing what to do, because the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, lost its entire reason for being. Because I mean, why should they be advocating social networks and social programs and things for the people if there's no effective socialist movement in the world? Why the hell should they be arguing on behalf of that when there's no place anybody else has to go? So what they do is they start dumping all of those social programs. They start setting aside all the Franklin Roosevelt programs all the way on down, and end up joining into a Republican agenda, the normal conservative agenda. And Bill Clinton ends up aggressively supporting the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Zone, in opposition to all the unions, all the Democratic constituencies, all the minority people, all the people who basically read books, you know. And he ends up supporting NAFTA and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades from Europe. And they end up establishing the global trade associations and everything. You know, that all of these things are being done right now, and the liberal Democratic Party doesn't have any position to oppose them, and that's why a guy like Obama, you know, makes all kinds of liberal sounding noises, but ends up basically caving in and caving in and caving in and caving in to the right. And that's what we've seen happen throughout his entire administration up to this point in time. Always using the excuse that, oh, well, we can't get anything done because there's these reactionaries in the House of Representatives. And so we have to cater to the reactionaries in the House of Representatives if we're going to get anything done at all. So now that they've taken over the Senate, the party say, well, if we're going to get something done, how about corporate tax reform? Like reducing the taxes for corporations, which has been a Republican agenda forever. And why not have another agenda like new trade agreements with all these foreign countries? New trade agreements, which is what the capitalist corporations want to have. They want to have privileged access to these resources around the world. So if Obama wants to really show that he can get something done, what he ought to do is join in on the Republican agenda. And that way he can get something done and he won't be a do-nothing president. So that's the situation that we face tonight. And so the question that obtains is, what advice do all these brilliant baby boomers, idealists, have in mind to be able to share with you as the millennial generation, as all of this is going on, generating two major national security states, one here in the West under the National Defense Authorization Act and spying on everybody, you know, monitoring everybody's telephones and monitoring all of your emails, every single email you send, every single photograph you send over your telephone, every single one of them, all being monitored by the government now and being stored away. And Obama making the argument that, what are you so upset about? You know, we're copying all of your communications and storing them all away, but in order to look at them, we'd have to get a warrant. He doesn't tell you that all the warrant has to say is that it goes to the FISA court, to the National Security Court. And the only standard is that they have to have reasonable grounds to believe that something of interest to the national security of the United States might possibly be being discussed. At which point they then look at everything. And all you people are being totally unreasonable, being upset about having all of your telephone calls monitored and all of the photographs and everything on your telephones being copied. Okay, so that's the situation that we're in. So what we want to do is we want to come together on Friday and we want to start to discuss what is it that can be done about this. And what is it that the idealists have to offer in discussing this in a concrete way, and what role is played in this by the insight that has been offered by Dr. Crane Brinton about the existence of this faculty that the greatest minds in Western culture recognize as evolving in our human family, and how does this relate to all of the different alternative worldviews that we have set forth here? How does one go about managing this reality to deal with the fact that as all of this is going on, these two major national security states are rising to power, one in China and one here in the West, confronting each other. Meanwhile, global warming and global climate change creeps up step by step by step, melting the ice caps and contaminating the planet. On that cheerful note, we'll gather together on Friday, and I'll start articulating some of the insights that the World War II the post-war generation has come to, the idealist generation, the baby boomers, and insert these insights into our discussion to see how it is they can help us practically as public intellectuals to participate in this debate in the years to come.